Everything cracked the instant senior Republicans refused to carry out Trump's command. For years, the power structure rested on a single assumption. When Donald Trump issued an order, compliance followed. Not debate, not negotiation. Obedience was the operating system. That assumption did not collapse loudly. It failed quietly, in public, with statements calibrated to sound procedural rather than rebellious. Senior party figures did not insult him. They did not challenge his legitimacy. They simply declined. This was not ideological disagreement. It was institutional math. Each leader understood the same reality at the same moment. Obedience now carried greater risk than defiance. Legal exposure was expanding. Electoral margins were narrowing. Donor patience was thinning. Aligning too closely with a legally encumbered figure no longer promised protection. It promised shared liability. Trump's expectation of loyalty was rooted in precedent. He had punished dissent before. Careers ended. Primary threats materialized. Media ecosystems mobilized. Yet this time the response was different because the environment had changed. Courts were active. Timelines were fixed. Evidence was cumulative. The cost-benefit equation no longer favored fear. The defiance was public because privacy no longer offered safety. Silence could be interpreted as complicity. Distance had to be visible. Carefully worded refusals functioned as signals to institutions watching closely: committees, judges, donors, and voters. This was not chaos. It was coordination without announcement. The illusion of unified authority did not explode. It thinned. And in that thinning space, a more dangerous question emerged, unanswered and unavoidable. Was this merely symbolic resistance, or the first irreversible fracture in a system built on obedience? No authority survives once refusal becomes rational policy unchecked. The order itself was not dramatic. It did not need to be. It was a directive designed to test whether obedience still functioned automatically inside the party. Compliance would have required public alignment with a position already under legal scrutiny, forcing senior figures to attach their names, statements, and future testimony to a narrowing defense. The instruction assumed the old mechanics still applied: loyalty first, consequences later. But the environment had shifted. Prosecutors were no longer speculative. Court calendars were no longer abstract. Every signature, interview, and procedural vote now carried discoverable weight. Obedience meant inheriting risk that could not be spun away by messaging discipline or partisan media. It meant trading institutional insulation for personal exposure. GOP leaders did not debate the substance of the order because substance was irrelevant. The calculation was operational. Would compliance increase legal jeopardy? Would it trigger donor flight? Would it complicate re-election timelines? Would it force sworn statements that could not be reconciled later? The answers converged quickly and unanimously. The cost curve moved sharply upward, and no countervailing benefit remained. This is where the narrative inverted. Refusal was not an act of defiance. It was an act of containment. Leaders were not asserting independence. They were minimizing blast radius. Trump's authority, once reinforced by credible punishment, now depended on something thinner: fear without enforcement. Threats without follow-through lose value the moment targets realize consequences are survivable. Primary challenges could be weathered. Media attacks could be absorbed. Legal entanglement could not. That asymmetry stripped the order of force. The party apparatus responded accordingly, not with rebellion, but with procedural distance and careful noncompliance. Markets, donors, and legal counsels were watching closely, recalibrating exposure as each refusal hardened further. What remained unclear was whether Trump understood that his command had failed not because it was controversial, but because it was unenforceable, and whether any lever still existed capable of restoring obedience once fear stopped working. The defiance was engineered to be seen, not whispered. Statements were released separately, but echoed the same refusal, stripped of emotion and rich with procedural language. Timing mattered. Each response landed within the same news cycle, denying any chance to isolate a single dissenter. Silence mattered too. Those who said nothing allowed the refusals to stand uncontested, amplifying them without adding fingerprints. This was communication by structure. Donors read it as a risk signal, courts read it as distance from intent, voters read it as permission to reconsider alignment. No one involved needed to announce coordination because coordination was obvious in its restraint. Public defiance works only when it looks inevitable rather than rebellious, and this was calibrated to feel routine. The message was not aimed at Trump, he was incidental. The audience was the institutional ecosystem that determined survival. Party committees, legal counsel, financial backers, and regulatory bodies were given clarity in advance. Exposure would not be shared. That clarity alters behavior downstream, accelerating withdrawals that never require public explanation. Historical patterns are unforgiving here. Power collapses when elites defect openly and others discover the cost of following is lower than the cost of staying. Each refusal reduced stigma for the next. Each measured statement widened the acceptable distance. Loyalty stopped being the default setting and became a conscious, risky choice. Distance became currency. Every inch away from the order lowered perceived liability and raised bargaining power. Institutional actors watch gradients, not declarations. As separation normalized, enforcement costs rose exponentially. Punishment required unanimity that no longer existed. The system began rewarding absence instead of allegiance, creating momentum that fed itself without coordination, instruction, or explicit rebellion. That shift quietly redefined risk thresholds across the party overnight without any formal announcement anywhere. What remained unanswered was scale. Whether this choreography was a pressure release valve or the first visible crack in a larger evacuation, no one yet dared to name. The enforcement myth depended on repetition, not reality. For years, Trump's power was assumed because it had once worked. Primary threats intimidated, fundraising channels punished, media ecosystems swarmed, but enforcement only functions when costs outweigh resistance, and that balance had inverted. Each traditional tool now produced diminishing returns while multiplying collateral damage. Primary challenges no longer guaranteed exile. Voters were fragmented, attention was diluted, and legal peril outweighed ideological purity tests. Fundraising threats lost force as major donors prioritized insulation over access, redirecting capital toward institutional stability rather than personal loyalty. Media retaliation saturated too quickly, generating noise without discipline. Exposure without consequence trained targets to endure rather than comply. Legal pressure accelerated the collapse. Every retaliatory move increased scrutiny. Every public attack widened evidentiary trails. Counsel advised restraint not out of cowardice, but survival. Fatigue set in across the party, not emotional exhaustion, but strategic depletion. Endless crisis stopped mobilizing fear and started draining resources. Trump's response followed pattern. Volume increased, accusation sharpened, loyalty tests intensified, but these reactions revealed the absence of leverage rather than its presence. Authority that must be shouted is already compromised. Power that relies on attention becomes brittle once attention fragments. The brutal inversion became undeniable. Enforcement now imposed greater cost on the enforcer than the target. Punishment triggered backlash, donor hesitation, and legal exposure, while resistance passed quietly, even profitably. The system adapted faster than the individual leading it. Institutional actors adjusted accordingly, compliance slowed, delays multiplied, ambiguity replaced obedience. No single act declared the myth dead, it simply stopped working, and when enforcement fails repeatedly, belief collapses with it. What remained dangerously unresolved was whether any mechanism still existed capable of restoring discipline once fear no longer functioned, or whether the party had crossed a threshold beyond which authority could no longer be reclaimed. The system adjusted without ceremony. Party leadership did not announce a break or issue a manifesto. Committees revised schedules. Council narrowed guidance. Power brokers recalculated exposure and quietly reweighted priorities. None of it required ideology. It required preservation. Institutions do not protect individuals. They protect continuity. Defiance stopped being interpreted as betrayal and started being processed as procedure. Leaders followed internal risk protocols rather than personal allegiance. Silence replaced statements because silence reduced liability. Alignment eroded not through confrontation, but through absence. Meetings occurred without him. Decisions advanced without consultation. Influence drained through bureaucratic channels that never needed to acknowledge the shift. This is how institutional power actually moves, not through dramatic exits, but through resource allocation, staff time redirected, legal budgets fortified, messaging streamlined to minimize entanglement. Each adjustment reduced dependency while maintaining outward stability. Trump remained present rhetorically, but structurally peripheral. Normalization accelerated the pressure. Once refusal became routine, loyalty required justification. That inversion altered incentives across the system. Donors sought predictability. Committees sought insulation. Candidates sought plausible deniability. The apparatus responded to those demands with mechanical efficiency. Structural isolation is not emotional. It is logistical. Historical patterns repeat here with precision. Parties survive scandals by narrowing exposure, not by defending personalities indefinitely. When a figure's risk profile eclipses their utility, institutions shift from amplification to containment. That shift does not announce itself. It simply operates. Trump's influence persisted in fragments, but fragments do not govern systems. Authority depends on integration. Isolation converts commands into noise. The more the institution optimized for survival, the less space remained for personal control. The unresolved tension hardened quietly. This pivot could function as a firewall, slowing damage and buying time, or it could remove safeguards altogether, accelerating legal and political exposure by severing protective infrastructure. The system had chosen itself. What remained unknown was whether that choice would contain the fallout or strip away the last barriers holding it back. Orders continued to go out, but the echo chamber answered back. Statements were issued, demands repeated, expectations asserted, yet the machinery that once translated words into action remained still. Calls went unreturned, committees delayed, allies acknowledged receipt without committing substance. Power without transmission is not power. It is broadcast, noise traveling without consequence through systems no longer tuned to respond. The chain of command had dissolved into a series of optional relationships. Loyalty became conditional, filtered through legal counsel, polling data, and donor tolerance. Public allies hedged their language, attaching qualifiers where obedience once stood. Private allies recalculated timelines and quietly exited. Some disappeared entirely, not out of drama, but efficiency, choosing obscurity over exposure as risk profiles hardened across the landscape. This exposed the existential truth beneath political authority. Volume does not compel. Rage does not mobilize. Compliance is voluntary, sustained only when participants believe the system will protect them. That belief was gone. Each unanswered directive reinforced the lesson. Trump could still speak, but speech no longer moved capital, votes, or institutions in any measurable direction, stripping commands of their operative meaning entirely. The pressure shifted inward. Political leverage gave way to personal consequence. Legal calendars advanced regardless of messaging. Financial obligations tightened as donors prioritized distance. Isolation amplified psychological strain, narrowing perception and escalating reactions that further alienated remaining allies and advisors who once moderated impulses. The feedback loop became self-reinforcing, accelerating detachment with every outburst meant to restore control. Historical collapses follow this pattern. Leaders lose authority not when challenged but when ignored. The silence is decisive. Without intermediaries, enforcement, or institutional amplification, command collapses into performance. The audience shrinks. The stakes concentrate. What remained unresolved was awareness, whether Trump recognized the severed chain and adapted, or whether he continued issuing orders into a system that no longer existed, mistaking volume for authority as the space around him emptied further. Judgment arrived without spectacle. Defiance hardened into procedure, and procedure became the system itself. What looked like rebellion was, in fact, succession without ceremony. GOP leaders did not overthrow authority. They transferred it, piece by piece, away from a figure whose presence had become pure liability. Institutions do not require loyalty. They require functionality, and functionality demanded separation. The party adapted the way systems always do under sustained pressure. Risk was isolated. Exposure was walled off. Decision-making continued through channels that no longer routed through Trump. Authority was redefined as continuity, not command. The loudest voice lost relevance as quieter mechanisms absorbed control. There was no purge because purges destabilize markets, donors, and courts. Stability required exclusion, not confrontation. This was the final inversion. Trump did not fall because enemies defeated him. He was removed because allies recalculated him. Power migrated to places that could still negotiate with regulators, reassure investors, and survive judicial scrutiny. Moral authority shifted toward institutional restraint, while bad faith theatrics lost operational value. The system rewarded predictability over performance. Inevitability replaced drama. No single vote ended it. No announcement confirmed it. The absence of response did the work. Orders went unanswered. Statements landed without echo. The machinery functioned precisely because it no longer depended on him. Collapse did not arrive as chaos. It arrived as normalization. This is how political authority actually ends, not with spectacle, but with accounting. When risk exceeds utility, systems sever attachment and move on. Trump remained visible, vocal, and aggrieved, yet structurally irrelevant. The verdict was rendered by process, not passion. Markets adjusted, pricing stability without him into expectations. Legal processes advanced unobstructed. Candidates recalibrated messages for survival, not loyalty. Each rational move compounded distance. The system did not celebrate victory. It recorded risk reduction, closing ranks around continuity while allowing the center to drift. What remains is not resolution, but consequence. A system has proven it can abandon its former center without collapsing itself, leaving a final, dangerous question suspended in the open. What happens to a leader who still believes he commands power that no longer exists?